Julia and Charles dined at the Savoy. Then they came back and to Charles' house, where Julia tried to seduce Charles, but he couldn't understand what was going on. And when Julia came home, she was thinking about that situation, why Charles couldn't spend the night with her, and she felt worried about it. She also thought how beauty she was, and if her beauty was enough. So in the morning, she had a talk with Eve about picking up on the street, and that day Julia decided to check if some guy would pick her up on the street, and she went for a walk to find the guys who would pick her up. But she met only one guy who was following her, and he did it because he recognized her in her a famous actress Julia Lambert. So he wanted to have an autograph for his young lady. Uh, uh, when we talk about the theater, Avis was one of those actresses who were quite sure about themselves from the first rehearsal, and she didn't know what was coming to her. Tom meant nothing to Julia anymore, but she had a score to settle with Avis, and she wasn't going to forget it. Julia knew Avis well enough to be sure that if she were dismissed, she would tell Tom that it was because Julia was jealous of her. But Tom loved her and would believe anything Avis said. Julia decided to say Michael that Avis was madly in love with him, and they had been rehearsing for a fortnight when Roger arrived from Austria. He had been spending a few weeks on a Carinthian lake, and Michael was afraid that he would drift through the time there and then go into a broker's office or even on the stage. So they decided that Julia should have a talk with Roger, but that talk wasn't so successful. Roger said Julia that Julia hadn't knew the difference between truth and make believe, and she never stopped acting. Also, Roger also said that she didn't love him. So when Michael went home, Julia was glad to see him and was so thankful that his arrival must end that awful situation, awful talk. And Michael was looking for all his 50 odd years incredibly, and handsome burst into the roommate in his manly way. Thrust out his hand to greet, after a 6-month absence, his only begotten son.